Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. I'm so glad you agreed to come, Annie Brooke, Faith's best friend, said as soon as Faith stepped through the doors. Faith's eyes darted around the room. Almost every young person in society was in attendance. Even as Annie weaved her arm through Faith's elbow, Faith felt nerves coil in her belly. Ever since she could remember, she had been overwhelmed in social situations. She dropped her gaze to the floor, feeling her cheeks burn hot and red. Annie, I shouldn't be here. Of course you should be here. You're young, you're pretty, and what better way to catch the eye of a handsome man with reputation and wealth? Annie insisted on dragging Faith further into the room. The ballroom was brimming with people. Faith never attended such social occasions. She preferred the safety of her home and the company of her piano to the music, voices, and laughter that surrounded her now. Her parents and her sisters insisted it was simply because she was shy and that she would overcome it with age. But at the age of 20, Faith was still painfully shy. Whenever she stepped into a room like this one, she couldn't help but feel as if everyone was looking at her, as if she didn't belong there, which was exactly how she felt. I think I should just go home. You don't want to spend the whole night dragging me along. I'm awkward, and I don't know how to act around men, Faith admitted quietly. Annie's laughter flowed over her. Faith often wondered why they were friends. Annie was outgoing, bubbly, and pretty, whereas Faith was quiet, often too serious and too pale. Her body reminded her of a scarecrow, and her hair was too light. You're not awkward, and when it comes to men, just be yourself. I've known many men who prefer timid girls like you over a talkative girl like me, Annie promised. Faith let out a quiet sigh as she followed Annie further into the dance hall. Around her, she heard people greeting her, some looking on with surprise to see her there. Had Annie not invited her in the presence of her parents, she wouldn't have come. But with her parents and Annie insisting she should come, Faith had no option. Her mother had taken her shopping the very next morning for the pale pink dress that she wore now. Annie stopped beside a group of women. Faith knew some of them from school and others through her sisters, but wouldn't consider any of them friends. She listened as Annie and the women discussed the men in attendance. Faith's jaw almost dropped when the women began to divvy up the men as if they were candy in a Halloween basket. Once everyone had their eye on someone for the night, Annie turned to Faith with a curious look. You didn't say who you were interested in? Faith shrugged. No one. She recognized some of the names mentioned, but she didn't want to make a fool of herself and agree to dance with any of them. Faith already knew she would either trip and fall over her feet, or she wouldn't be able to get out a single word. Both had happened in the past. Just another reason she shouldn't be here in the first place. She and Annie stood at a table, while Annie surveyed the dancing. Look, Faith, doesn't that look like fun? Annie said with a longing look. Faith glanced at the door and nodded. It certainly does. A few moments later, a man approached them. Faith's heart began to race even as her head began to spin. She didn't recognize him, but crossed her fingers that he wasn't going to talk to her. Relief washed over her when he asked Annie to join him for a dance. Faith stood and watched her friend dance, a broad smile on her face, wishing she could be more like Annie. For a moment, Faith couldn't help but be envious. Prosody. Regardless of what her friends and her parents thought, Faith wanted to find love. She wanted to have a family of her own and a man that loved her. But how would she ever find someone who would be willing to court a girl who couldn't string two words together in the company of a stranger? In the corner of the room, Faith spotted a beautiful, grand piano. A smile curved her mouth even as her feet began to move in its direction. A band was playing beside it, but Faith couldn't seem to stop herself. She moved around the piano and took a seat. The violinist looked at her curiously before he nodded, giving her permission to join in. Faith's fingers danced over the piano keys, the piano complementing the band. She felt her fear fade away, the knots her stomach untied as the music flowed over her and through her. Soon she had forgotten all about the dance and all the people present. It was just her and the piano. Only when the song ended did Faith realize the band was no longer accompanying. She looked up only to see the musicians watching her with admiration, none of them playing their instruments. Even some of the dancing couples had stopped to look at her. Faith felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Her breath caught as her fingers began to tremble. She lifted them from the piano keys, her gaze darting through the dance hall for Annie. Suddenly, loud applause rang out through the room. Feeling overwhelmed by all the eyes on her and the thundering applause, Faith moved away from the piano and all but ran for the doors. She pushed her way past people trying to compliment her, her only goal to get out. When the cool evening air slapped at her skin, she drew in a deep breath and realized she was safely outside. Her parents' carriage wouldn't come for her for another 2 hours, but Faith didn't care. She'd rather walk home than return to the dance. As she had said when she arrived, she should never have come. Chapter 2. As Claire de Lune filled the drawing room, Faith lost herself in the music. Debussy was one of her favorite composers. His music didn't just uplift the spirits, it reached the soul. It was as if he composed music that turned emotions into sounds. Faith had never played the piano more than over the last few weeks. Ever since her return home, cold and early on the night of the dance, playing the piano was the only time she managed to forget the way anyone had looked at her, or how they had watched her run off like a scared little girl. Annie and her parents had hoped that she would catch the eye of a handsome gentleman. Instead, Faith had ensured that no man in society would ever look at her again. She had embarrassed herself. If only she hadn't been so shy and so overwhelmed by the applause. She had gone over that moment 1,000 times since and had thought of hundreds of ways she should have reacted instead. But it was too late now. Faith, her mother stepped into the drawing room holding an envelope. Faith lifted her hands from the keys. "Yes, Mother?" "A letter from Angel." Faith's smile was instant as she walked toward her mother. "How I wish we could have spent Christmas with them this year." "I know, dear, me too. But your father has too much going on at the bank, and besides, you know this time of year makes for treacherous travel." Elizabeth Jones smiled warmly at her youngest daughter. "I know." Faith nodded, accepting the letter. Her mother disappeared through the door. Their brownstone was quite large, and everyone had their own preferred room in the house. For Faith, it was the drawing room because the piano was there. For her mother, it was the morning room. Her mother would invite friends over for lunch or sit by the window and read for hours. For her father, John Jones, it was his study. Faith curled up on a chaise lounge and opened the envelope before drawing out the letter. Excitement washed over her as she recognized Angel's handwriting. "My dearest Faith, I was so sorry to hear about your first dance that ended in disaster. I wish I could have been there for you. You have to remember that they weren't looking at you because they were judging you. They were admiring your talent. Ever since you first began to play the piano, your talent has been evident. I understand that you don't like the attention, but with a talent like yours, you're bound to be admired when you play in public. Perhaps you should visit us again. Grace and I could take you to a dance in town. Perhaps then you might feel a little more confident. We miss you terribly. Grace and I were talking just other the day about how we used to play when we were young. I miss those days, but I know that we all need to move on with our own lives. Speaking of lives, my life has been awfully busy. Jacob is chattering a mile a minute. None of the sentences make sense to any of us, but regardless, he keeps talking. Travis is teaching him how to ride. My nerves are frayed at the edges, but I know Travis takes great care with him. As for Grace, she is as happy as I've ever seen her. Cooper is truly a wonderful father. Little Daisy is now crawling and makes for quite a busy bee. When Grace isn't running after Daisy, she's exhausted from it. How I wish you could be here to see your nephew and niece grow. I know Mother and Father would agree to you coming for a visit. Why not ask them? As for the social engagements, you'll gain confidence in time, and then you'll attend one again. The memory amongst members of society is only as long as it takes for new gossip to arrive, which in my opinion happens weekly in Boston. I'll write again before Christmas, but until then, play a Christmas carol and think of me. Love, Angel. Faith pressed the letter to her chest and hugged it as if she was hugging Angel in the flesh. She moved back to the piano and began to play Angel's favorite Christmas carol. As she played the familiar notes, she found herself dreaming of the life Angel and Grace had. Both her sisters had found love in the West. First, Angel had traveled west to marry Travis and become a teacher. Only a year later, Grace had traveled west after being scarred in an accident during a snowstorm. She had been devastated when her proposed husband turned her away because of the scar. But everything happened for a reason. Grace had traveled to Angel, who lived nearby, and found herself falling in love with Cooper, Travis's good friend and ranch hand. Now both her sisters were happily married with children of their own. That was exactly what Faith wanted for herself. But until she could overcome her shyness, it was a dream she knew she would never realize. As if her hands were expressing her emotions, the Christmas carol flowed into a heartbreaking melody. A tear slipped over her cheek as her heart ached in her chest. As her fingers danced over the keys, she couldn't help but feel as if this would be all she would do for the rest of her life. She would live at home with her parents and play the piano for company. She loved her parents and she loved playing the piano, but she wanted so much more from her life. She wanted to have the joy that her sisters had found. She wanted love. Chapter 3. A sigh escaped Faith the moment she stepped into the dining room. The table had been set for 4 instead of 3, which could only mean her parents were making another attempt at introducing her to an eligible man of the right stature from an acceptable family. Ever since the disaster dance, as Faith had come to think of that horrible night in November, her parents had taken to inviting men known through acquaintances to introduce to Faith. It didn't matter how many times Faith asked them to stop. Her mother insisted it was for the best. Faith was grateful that her parents weren't forcing her to attend another social event, but to have strange men at their dinner table at least every fortnight was somehow even worse. At a social event, Faith could shrink into the background and avoid everyone. At their dinner table, she had no choice but to be present. "There you are," Elizabeth said with a warm smile as Faith walked into the dining room. A frown creased her brow as she looked at Faith's choice of dress. "Are you sure you want to wear that, dear? Liam Turner V is joining us for dinner. His father is one of your father's investors at the bank. Your father arranged for him to come to dinner tonight. You want to make a good impression, don't you?" Faith's brow furrowed. "Mother, please can you stop trying to play matchmaker? It's not working, and it's just as uncomfortable for the poor men you invite as it is for me." "Nonsense," her mother exclaimed. "Henry Altenburg thoroughly enjoyed our company." Faith sighed quietly. Henry Altenburg was a glutton that finished 4 plates of food and nearly fell asleep at the table. "Go upstairs and change into the lilac dress. It brings out the violet in your eyes," her mother insisted. Faith knew that to argue would amount to nothing. She turned and headed upstairs like a little girl being told what to wear for church on Sunday. By the time she descended the stairs a second time, she could hear the unfamiliar voice of a man in the drawing room. Knowing that she was expected to join her parents for a glass of sherry before dinner, she summoned her courage and headed in that direction. "Faith, there you are." John Jones beamed at his daughter. He met Faith at the door and took her hand before he led her to the stranger. "Liam, this is my daughter, Faith. Faith, meet Liam Turner V." Faith summoned a smile as Liam kissed her hand. She resisted the urge to ask what had happened to the first 4 Liam Turners. "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Faith. Your father mentioned you were beautiful, but he didn't say you were breathtaking." Liam charmed her with a dashing smile. Faith's heart began to race as a blush colored her cheeks. She quickly looked away, suddenly unable to speak. "You'll have to be patient with our Faith. She's a little shy," Elizabeth quickly explained. Liam smiled at her as a wolf smiles at its prey before devouring it. "I'm sure she'll warm to me soon enough." When one of the servants rang the dinner bell, Faith almost sighed with relief. The sooner this evening was over, the better. Elizabeth sat down on the bed in her nightdress and let out a heavy sigh. "John, what are we going to do?" "Sleep?" John asked as he slipped into bed. Elizabeth shook her head. "You know I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Faith. She barely spoke 2 words all night." "She's just shy. She'll get over it," John insisted. Elizabeth turned to her husband with a doubtful look. "We've been saying that since she turned 14. She's 20, John. Most girls her age are engaged or married already. If she doesn't find a way to interact with gentlemen, she'll become a spinster with a piano instead of a cat. At least it's a nice piano." John shrugged with a smile. "I'm serious, John," Elizabeth insisted. John sat upright and nodded with a heavy sigh. "I know, dear. I'm concerned about her as well, but I simply don't know what to do. It seems that as soon as there is a stranger in her presence, she shrivels into the background. The only people she is comfortable around are family and Annie and a few of her friends. If only the doctor had medicine for shyness." "Don't be ridiculous. You know there isn't such a thing. We have to think of something. I can't stand seeing her so lonely. Since Angel and Grace moved out west, she's withdrawn into herself even more." Elizabeth sighed, shaking her head. "Perhaps if we find someone that shares her interests," John suggested. Elizabeth's eyes brightened with hope. "John, that's perfect. We find a musician, one that comes from a wealthy family, of course. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to care for her. But surely she'll be able to connect with a musician?" "We can try," John agreed. "Can I go to sleep now?" Elizabeth nodded, even as the wheels in her head began to turn. She didn't know any musicians, but surely it couldn't be hard to find someone that enjoyed music as much as Faith. Perhaps if they had music in common, Faith would be comfortable. A short while later, John's soft snores filled the room, but Elizabeth kneeled beside her bed regardless. She closed her eyes and began to pray. She prayed for the Lord to bless her daughters, and then she prayed that the Lord would find a suitable partner for Faith, one that was patient and kind, and one that would make her feel confident. Because as a mother, Elizabeth knew that shyness was only a symptom of a lack of confidence, and nothing gave a woman confidence like love. Chapter 4. "A cellist?" Annie asked, horrified. Faith couldn't help but laugh at Annie's expression. "I know, it was horrible. All through dinner, he kept trying to compare a piano to the cello. He asked me about calluses and shoulder pains as if playing the piano was a physical risk." "What was your mother thinking?" Annie laughed loudly. "Careful. Next, she might just invite a flutist. Then you'll have to listen to him talk about breath control and lung exertion all night." "Don't even mention it. You might give her an idea." Faith sighed. "I honestly don't know what she's trying to achieve. All she's achieving by inviting these random men to dinner is she's making me even more averse to actually meeting someone." "I'm sure they're just concerned," Annie said with a kind look. "We all are. Why? I'm happy. I just don't enjoy talking to people I don't know." "If you never talk to new people, you'll never make new friends," Annie pointed out. Faith smiled and playfully tossed a cushion in her friend's direction. "I have you. I don't need more friends." Annie's nose wrinkled even as a frown creased her brow. "Maybe not for long." "What? Oh, goodness, Annie. You aren't sick, are you?" Faith asked, wide-eyed. Annie shook her head with a curious smile. "Unless it's an ailment of the heart, not at all." "What do you mean?" Faith couldn't for the life of her understand what Annie meant. "You remember how Angel and Travis met?" Annie asked. "I might have done the same." "You're writing to a man you don't know? Annie, surely you know that Angel simply got lucky. It's dangerous, never mind irresponsible." Faith shook her head with disappointment. "You might be right, but perhaps I might also find love." Annie smiled dreamily. "His name is Caleb Mason, and he lives in Indiana. Since that is where your sisters were, I thought it might be a good place to start. You've told me how beautiful it is and how nice the weather is there. Honestly, I didn't expect him to write back." "How long have you corresponded with this Caleb Mason?" Faith was very surprised. She had known Annie to be outgoing, but not this outgoing. "I've received 2 letters from him." "Oh, Faith, please stop looking at me like I've gone mad." "I like him. He seems very nice. He He works on a ranch and drives cattle. He's a real cowboy, Faith. He's looking for love, and one day he wants a family, just like I do. Annie raised her brows in a questioning look. Can't you just be happy for me? I will be. I mean, I am. I just don't want you to get hurt, Faith explained. And I won't. I'll be very careful. Annie's eyes widened with excitement. Faith, that's the perfect way for you to meet someone. You don't have to meet them in person at first, and you can take your time thinking of a reply to their letters. It's brilliant. Wait, what? Faith asked. You should write to one of the men through the matrimonial times. Annie jumped off the bed, a wide smile on her face. It's the perfect way for you to get to know someone before you meet. That way, when you meet, he won't be a stranger. Annie, I won't be able to do that. I won't even know which one to pick. Faith shook her head, already shooting down the idea. What if you don't have to choose? What if I told you that Caleb mentioned to me that his boss, Jared Reed, has been thinking about placing an advertisement himself? I could ask Caleb to tell his boss about you, and if he's interested, instead of placing an advertisement, he could just write to you? Annie suggested excitedly. That way, if it works out, we would live together on the same ranch. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So, Faith frowned hesitantly. Annie, I don't know. I don't think this is a good idea. You never think anything that doesn't involve a piano is a good idea. I'm going to ask Caleb to talk to Jared, and that's that. At least I'm not inviting him to your dinner table. Annie crossed her arms firmly. Faith shook her head. You can do what you want, but if he writes to me, just don't expect me to reply. There is no way I'm going to correspond with a man thousands of miles away. You heard what happened to Grace. Do you want that to happen to us? Annie cocked a brow. You and I both know that Grace wasn't looking for love. She was looking for wealth. She found someone just as shallow as she used to be and got bitten by it. You can't compare that horrible man to Caleb or Jared. How do you know? You haven't met either of them, Faith insisted. Annie's mouth curved slowly. Because I know how to listen to my heart. My heart has whispered to me over and over again that Caleb is the man of my dreams. That's how. Come on, Faith, be happy for me. I've been praying for the right husband since I can remember. I have complete faith in God. He made me see Caleb's advertisement, and he made Caleb choose to reply to my letter and no one else's. Faith sighed heavily. I'm happy for you. I'm just concerned. Funny how I said that just a few moments ago about you, Annie pointed out. They shared a smile, but Faith crossed her fingers that Annie would be so excited to hear from Caleb again that she would forget all about her plan to ask him to talk to Jared. She didn't need another person in her life trying to play matchmaker. Chapter 5. Faith sat in the drawing room with all her sheet music laid out around her on the floor. Sheet music was hard to find at the best of times, so it was very important to her to take good care of the music that she had. She had sorted the music by composer, but once she was done, it just didn't feel right. When she played the piano, she didn't have Beethoven, Bach, or Mozart days. She played the music that suited her mood. Faith gathered all the sheet music and set the pile in front of her before she made a mental list of all the different moods of music she enjoyed. Soon she began sorting the sheet music all over again. This time the piles were for nostalgia, joy, sadness, calm, anxiousness, and finally, love. A smile curved her mouth as she began to arrange the different piles into binders to make sure they were kept safe. Feeling triumphant that she had completed the task she had set out to do, she took the binder with music filled with joyous melodies and sat down at the piano. She had just settled her fingers on the keys when a maid popped her head into the drawing room. Mail for you, Miss Jones. Faith's face split in two, eager to hear from either of her sisters. The last time Grace had written, she had entertained her with stories about Daisy's development and descriptions of the adorable dresses Jessica Scott had made for her daughter. Although Jessica was Angel's mother-in-law, she had become a self-appointed grandmother to Daisy as well. A frown creased Faith's brow as she took the letter and read the envelope. She didn't recognize the handwriting. Instead of Angel's precise and perfectly shaped letters, or Grace's curvy letters that flowed into each other's, the handwriting on the envelope was smaller and less neat. Curiosity piqued. Faith tore open the envelope and pulled out a couple of sheets with more of the same handwriting. She sank onto one of the chairs and began to read. Dear Faith, I am sure you are as surprised to receive this letter as I am to be writing it. My name is Jared Reed, and I heard about you from my friend Caleb. I'm sure you are aware that Caleb has been corresponding with your friend Annie Brooke for quite some time now. A gasp escaped Faith as she dropped the pages to the floor. She had completely forgotten about Annie's offer more than a month before. In all honesty, she had truly thought Annie had been joking. But now, as she looked at the letter in her hands from a stranger, she knew she couldn't just toss it into the dancing flames of the fireplace. Curiosity and intrigue made her pick up the letter again and continue reading. I have been very hesitant to write this letter, although I've had your address for a few weeks now. I'm sure you think me insane for reaching out to a woman I have never met. I assure you, I am perfectly sane. Let me explain why I wanted to write to you. From what Caleb told me, I understand that you are shy and a little withdrawn. I wouldn't call myself shy, but I will admit that I am not comfortable talking to women I do not know. The mere fact that we have something in common urged me to reach out to you. After Caleb began corresponding with Annie, he's been encouraging me to place an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. I've considered it, to be honest, but I haven't yet dared to do so. Placing an advertisement for a wife and future partner makes me feel like a cow about to be auctioned to the highest bidder. Perhaps I am insane. You might wonder why Caleb suggested I place an advertisement. The answer to that is quite simple, actually. I am 26 years old with a land claim that stretches beyond the horizon. I always believed that once I had my ranch and my house built, and a few head of cattle in the fields, I would be a happy man. But now, I have come to realize that happiness means nothing if you have no one with whom to share it. Making plans for the future feels like a hollow chore if you plan a solitary future. Instead, I find myself wanting a life partner, someone to share the successes, someone to help carry the burdens, and someone with whom to build a life. I dream of having children and a house that is welcoming instead of empty. I dream of meeting someone who will capture my heart, even as she offers hers freely. Caleb told me that you enjoy playing the piano, so perhaps if I describe it to you like a song, you will understand this yearning better. In the best melodies, there is always a crescendo. It's as if the whole song builds to prepare you for the high point that makes you feel as if a song has meaning. Through everything I've achieved in my life, I feel as if my life has yet to reach the crescendo, that point that gives it meaning. I can assure you that I am an honest man with Christian values. My home might not include the luxury and comforts found in the city, but it's sturdy and has a lovely view from the porch. My income is of such standard that I will have no problem caring for a family. As for where I live, Reed Ranch is located a few miles from Riverview. Caleb mentioned that you have family in Waterfall, which is only a 3-hour wagon ride from Riverview. If you doubt my sincerity, you are welcome to send someone to meet me in person. I won't try to persuade you to write to me. Instead, I will simply ask you this. Do you find yourself dreaming of your life's crescendo? If you do, then I look forward to hearing from you. If you don't, then it's been my profound pleasure to know you have at least read my words. Kindest regards, Jared Reed. Faith found herself reading the letter over a second time. She had no idea who Jared Reed was, what he looked like, or if he was even a good man. But for some reason, she already found herself replying to him in her mind. She couldn't be sure if it was his honesty, his reference to music, or the way he described his own lack of confidence when it came to the fairer sex. But before Faith even realized it, she had moved to the writing desk and was replying to a stranger. In Chapter 6. It seems Miss Jones found something in your letter worth corresponding with, Caleb said as he hopped out of the saddle. Jared looked up from watering the horses, a frown creasing his brow beneath his wide-brim hat. Say what? I say Annie's friend wrote you a letter. Caleb laughed, handing Jared the letter. Here I am going into town to pick up a letter from my sweetheart. Lo and behold, there was one for you as well. Seems to me we're courting two girlfriends from Boston now. Jared shook his head as he held the letter in his hand. Perhaps she just wrote to politely decline to correspond with me. You won't know if you don't open it, Caleb shrugged. Jared nodded and began walking away from the corral. Without even looking up, he moved towards the trail that led towards a creek a couple of 100 yards from his house. He took a seat on the winter grass and shook his head. When he had written to Faith Jones, it had been on a whim. He never actually expected her to write back, especially not after Caleb had made it very clear that she couldn't even string two words together in the company of men. He carefully opened the envelope, as if ripping it would hurt Faith in some way. With the sun on his back and the creek bubbling past, Jared began to read. Dear Mr. Reed, your letter was very unexpected, as you can very well imagine. When Annie mentioned you, I begged her not to reach out. But now that you have, I am pleasantly surprised by your honesty. I won't ask my family in Waterfall to pay you an unexpected visit, at least not yet. I found myself touched by your words. In a way, they very much represent the way I feel. Although there are numerous social occasions for courting in Boston, I find myself overwhelmed whenever I've tried to attend. Ever since I could remember, the piano had been my best friend. Perhaps it's the piano's fault that I prefer its company to the company of people. As you can imagine, my social awkwardness has made it quite challenging for me to even consider dreaming of a future such as the one you describe. I've come to accept that no man wants to court a girl who appears mute. But I'm sure you can see through my words that I am not mute at all. Instead, I find words constantly forming in my head. I just struggle to utter them in strange company. I understand what you say about your life not having reached its crescendo. I'm not sure if you expect a crescendo to form through our letters, but I will say that receiving your letter was a high note for me. I can't help but agree with your description of the matrimonial times. Although my eldest sister, Faith, found true love through the pages of the publication, my middle sister was dreadfully hurt by it. To me, it seems almost like desperation for a woman to write to a stranger. I've heard about the shortage of women in the West and understand the place in society for such a publication. But like you, I simply do not feel it is the right way for me to find love. Reed Ranch truly sounds wonderful. I can only imagine how lovely the sunset must be from your porch. During the times I've visited my sisters in Waterfall, I've always enjoyed the beautiful colors that paint the sky at sunset. Unlike Boston, I find the weather here to be more forgiving as well. I imagine you are having balmy days at the moment, where we are still firmly in the throes of winter. I will not waste any more of your time, but I will say that I look forward to hearing from you again. That is, if you found my letter as captivating as I found yours. Kind regards. Faith. Jared let out a whoop of joy. Her friend might have described her as shy and withdrawn, but Jared found her enchanting and lovely. Her honesty was sweet, and so was the way her letters curved on the page. A smile curved the corners of his mouth, knowing that he wouldn't have to place an advertisement in the matrimonial times after all. He walked back towards the house with a smile splitting his face in two. And, was she politely asking you to stop bothering her? Caleb asked at the sight of him. Jared shook his head. She politely invited me to write to her again. She seems wonderful, Caleb, almost as wonderful as you made her seem. Just remember, she's painfully shy. I can't imagine she revealed much in her letter, Caleb asked. Jared simply shrugged. What she revealed in the letter is for me to know alone. But I can assure you, she's not as shy on paper as she claims to be in person. Caleb's chuckle drifted after Jared as he walked into the house. He took a look around and found himself hopeful that one day perhaps Faith would turn his house into a home. Chapter 7. He sounds perfectly lovely, Elizabeth Jones said, smiling at her husband. Faith turned to her father with a hopeful look. What do you think, Father? As your mother says, he sounds like a suitable match. If he has a ranch anything like the Scott Ranch, I'm sure he'll have no problem supporting a wife and a family. John Jones set down the letters and smiled at Faith. Faith felt excitement course through her veins. In her mind, she heard a few high notes dance in a lovely melody. Ever since she had received Jared's first letter, it seemed her days were filled with only high notes. She couldn't remember the last time she had reached for her binder with sad music. Over the last 6 weeks, she and Jared had written to each other numerous times. With every letter Jared sent her, Faith found herself liking him even more. It was an exhilarating feeling to finally have met someone she could talk to. Of course, she had yet to meet him in person, but when she finally did, he wouldn't feel like a stranger at all. He would feel like the man who had shared his dreams with her, the man who had made her feel confident about her music and her dreams for the future. Annie nudged Faith in the side and widened her eyes. Faith nodded, remembering the reason they were there in the first place. Annie had offered to support her when she told her parents about Jared, and in return, Faith would ask her parents' permission to travel to Riverview with Annie to meet both Jared and Caleb. So if you think he is a suitable match, surely you agree that it should be arranged that we meet? Faith asked her parents. Her parents shared a silent look before her father turned to her with a pleasant smile. Yes, I think that would be appropriate given your social deficiencies. You make it sound like she has scurvy. Elizabeth quickly chastened her husband. Faith and Annie shared a laugh before Faith turned to her mother for her response. Your father is right. I think an introduction would be a good idea, her mother agreed. Faith nodded eagerly. Wonderful. Annie and I will be leaving for Riverview on Wednesday, and we will be returning the following week. It would give us a chance to meet them and to see the ranch for ourselves. Under no circumstances will you be traveling to Riverview, her father snapped harshly. But you just said, Faith trailed off. Your father and I agree that you should meet, but you are not traveling to Riverview. Remember what happened to Grace? We will not allow another one of our daughters to suffer that humiliation and devastation so far from home, Elizabeth explained firmly. If these gentlemen are as eager to meet you as you are to meet them, they can travel to Boston. Your father and I would for once like to meet the man courting our daughter before an engagement is announced. But we, Annie and I, will be traveling together. We've got it all planned out. Faith couldn't help but feel disappointed. She had thought of their journey to Riverview as an adventure, the first adventure she'd ever taken. Then undo your plans. You can write to these men and explain to them that they are welcome to visit you in Boston. It's much more appropriate for men to travel that distance than for a lady. Faith looked at her mother with disappointment in her eyes. Her parents had all but forced her to start courting, and now that she had found someone she liked, they refused to let her travel to meet him. Annie turned to her with an encouraging smile. Your parents are right, Faith. Perhaps it will be better for them to travel to Boston. I'm sure my parents would also like to meet Caleb. See, at least your friend sees the sense in them coming to Boston, John pointed out. Prosody. What if they don't come? What if they can't leave the ranch? Faith asked quietly, feeling as if the crescendo she had been about to reach had just begun its plummet towards a tragedy. Her mother moved towards her and reached for her hand before meeting her gaze. If Jared is really as fond of you as he seems to be in his letters, he'll come. They'll come, Annie said, assuring her as well. Faith let out a hopeful sigh. I hope they come. And when they do, I'd like to invite them to dinner. You and your beau as well, Annie. You've all but grown up in this home, and I wouldn't feel satisfied if I didn't meet him as well, John insisted with a smile. Then I guess we'd better go send a telegram. I'm not sure if a letter will reach them in time. Faith said, standing up. Annie joined her. We might even look at dresses to wear when we meet them at the train station. Faith couldn't help but laugh. In some ways, Annie reminded her so much of her sister Grace. Grace had always been on the lookout for an occasion for a new dress. Often she didn't even need an occasion to buy a new dress. She simply did so for the love of it. Good idea, Annie, Elizabeth smiled at the girls. Faith and Annie collected their coats and headed outside. As soon as they were out of earshot of her parents, Faith turned to Annie with a baffled look. I thought they'd wanted to marry me off. Now it's as if they've changed their minds. Not at all, Faith. You're their youngest daughter. It's only natural for them to be a little more protective of you. Besides, after what happened with Grace, you can't blame them for being cautious. Faith nodded. She had looked forward to their journey westward, but as she and Annie walked through the streets of Boston, she couldn't help but feel excited that Jared might be coming north instead. She could show him all her favorite places, and he could get to know her where she felt most at home. Perhaps her parents had a good idea after all. Chapter 8. Faith felt the familiar tug of nerves in her belly as she stood on the train platform. Just as her mother had predicted, Caleb and Jared were only too happy to travel north to Boston instead of having the girls travel west. They couldn't stay for an entire week, but 3 days ought to be enough for Faith to find out if Jared was the one who would bring music to her heart. She wore a new dress, one she and Annie had picked out. It was a pale shade of peach, the fabric flowing and flattering. A waistband revealed her tiny waist, even as billowy sleeves softened her bony shoulders. When she had looked in the mirror before leaving home, she realized Annie had been right. The color suited her complexion. It was almost as if the shade of peach brought warmth to her pale skin. "Here they come," Annie said excitedly from beside her, wearing a navy dress with white trim. "How do you know it's them?" Faith asked, following Annie's gaze. 2 men, wearing hats, waistcoats, brown trousers, and flannel shirts, were walking towards them. The one on the left had kind eyes and a generous smile. The one on the right was taller. His eyes were a peculiar shade of blue, even from a distance. His jaw was square and his shoulders broad. Even without asking, Faith already knew that the man on the right had to be Jared. "The hats," Annie laughed. "No one else here is wearing Stetsons." "Oh," Faith nodded as Jared met her gaze. She felt a light blush color her cheeks as her heart began to race. She had been terrified of this moment ever since Jared had agreed to travel to meet her. Although they had communicated so many times through their letters, she couldn't help but fear that her usual shyness might intervene, leaving her unable to utter a single word. "Breathe, Faith," Annie coaxed beside her in a hushed tone, her smile in place. Faith nodded and drew in a sharp breath. The nerves coiled even tighter into small balls of torture in her belly. The 2 men stopped in front of them. Jared was still holding her gaze. Faith couldn't seem to look away. It was as if she recognized him even as she was afraid of what he would think of her. "Which was it this morning, Beethoven or Mozart?" he asked with a charming grin. Faith felt her mouth curve shyly. "It was Debussy." "Then you must be Faith," the other man said, turning to Annie. "I'm Caleb." Annie laughed lightly. "I thought as much." While Caleb and Annie got better acquainted, Jared held out his hand to Faith. "I recognized you the moment I stepped off the train. It's such a pleasure to finally meet you, Faith." Faith couldn't help but feel thoroughly charmed by Jared's kind words. A smile curved her mouth as she held out her hand. Jared lightly brushed a kiss over it before letting it go. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel awkward or shy. Instead, she felt as if she had known Jared forever. "I recognized you too. I'm glad you came," Faith said quietly. "When I received your telegram, Caleb had to stop me from getting on the next train out of town." His laughter was just as attractive as his eyes. "We would have come. It's just—" Faith trailed off when Jared shook his head. "I agree with your father. If I had a daughter, I'd want to meet her sweetheart as well." His smile softened as he lowered his chin and looked at her from beneath his eyelashes. "Am I your sweetheart, Faith?" Faith's heart skipped a beat, not in the usual way that had her running for the exit, but in a way that made her feel bold and confident. "Only if I am yours." "If you weren't, I wouldn't be here," Jared said simply, holding out his arm. Faith hesitated for a moment before she slipped her arm through his elbow. %. As they walked, Faith realized she had never walked with her head held as high or with a skip in her step as she was now. She smiled over her shoulder at Annie, happy to see her friend just as happy as she was. From the train station, Caleb and Jared insisted on taking them to dinner. Annie had made arrangements for them to spend the weekend in a boarding house, but they would hear nothing of having a rest first. It was as if they were just as eager to spend time with Annie and Faith as the girls were to spend more time with them. When they reached the restaurant, Jared took the lead. He did it in a way that didn't offend Caleb, but rather encouraged others to follow. He had a quiet authority that Faith found very attractive. When they took their seats, she turned to him with a smile of adoration. She hadn't known what to expect when the train pulled into the station, but she hadn't for a second expected to be smitten within minutes of meeting Jared. A band played classical music in the background, and as the song reached its crescendo, Jared turned to Faith with a knowing smile. When he reached for her hand spontaneously, Faith accepted it without hesitation. Chapter 9. Everyone was seated at the dinner table in the Jones dining room. For the first time in years, Faith was satisfied with the company at the dinner table. Although she hadn't spoken much to Caleb, she felt very comfortable talking to Jared. Last night, when they had been out for dinner, he hadn't pushed her for conversation. Instead, when she became quiet and a little withdrawn, he had engaged her with a topic of interest. Soon, Faith was talking to him as she would to a close family friend, completely confident and at ease in his company. She glanced at her mother at the one side of the table before she glanced at her father. The introductions had gone smoothly over a glass of port, but Faith would have to wait until later that evening to learn what her parents thought of Jared Reed. Jared smiled at her from across the table. "I can see now that coming to Boston definitely had its benefits. The food is delicious," Faith nodded. "Consuela is a magician in the kitchen." "I'm glad you enjoy it, Jared. I made it clear that we were expecting important guests for dinner," Elizabeth added with a smile. "I wouldn't say important, but I would say grateful." Jared smiled kindly at her mother before he returned his gaze to Faith. "I couldn't help but notice your piano in the living room. It's quite magnificent. I've never seen anything like it." "Perhaps you will treat them to a song after dinner, Faith?" her mother queried. Faith's eyes widened. "I'm sure no one wants me to bother them with the piano, Mother. You can hardly hear a word when I'm playing." Jared smiled at her with an encouraging look. "I'd love nothing more than to hear you play. Might I put in a request?" Faith frowned. "You know classical music?" "Not much, but there is one song I remember from my childhood. My mother used to play on the piano when I wouldn't take my afternoon nap," Jared explained. He had not mentioned his parents before, and Faith couldn't help but be curious. "Where were you raised?" "New York," Jared said simply. "My father was a dock worker, my mother a seamstress. After my father had an accident on the docks, they paid a handsome amount for him not to make it public. My mother received a piano, and I received a ticket westward." "Are they still there?" Elizabeth asked before Faith could. "No, unfortunately they both passed away. My father passed from consumption and my mother not too long after him," Jared answered quietly. "I'm sorry to hear that. What song is it that you remember?" Faith asked curiously. "Claire de Lune." Jared chuckled softly. "My mother used to say if you listened to a song about the moon, the stars wouldn't keep you awake." "That's adorable," Faith said with a smile. "Tell me more about your ranch, Mr. Reed," John prompted from the other side of the table. "Faith says you have a herd of cattle?" "That's right, Mr. Jones. I started with only 10 head of cattle and over the years managed to build up quite a herd. It's hard work, but the rewards make it worth it." "And this town of yours, I take it it's quite civilized. I've heard of towns in the West that only boast a saloon and a sheriff's office," John continued. Jared laughed. "It's quite civilized, Mr. Jones. We have a general merchandiser, a barber, a French cologne shop. We even have a post office and a church. Good to know." "John, stop frightening the man. Jared, please, call him John," Elizabeth insisted. Faith smiled to herself. She could already tell from her mother's tone of voice and her father's questions that her parents liked Jared. After dinner, everyone moved to the drawing room. Faith had hoped that they would forget their request for her play, but she had no such luck. Her mother almost instantly ushered her toward the piano. Faith retrieved her sheet music and took a seat behind the piano. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, something she always did to shut everyone and everything out before she lost herself in the music. As she began to play, her body moved along with the movement of her hands. She swayed lightly to and fro and played to her heart's content. Only when she reached the crescendo did she realize she was looking at Jared and he was looking at her. Usually, when Faith played her music, she wouldn't make eye contact at all. It only made her nervous and shy. But as she looked into Jared's eyes, she felt something shift inside her. She didn't feel nervous or shy. Instead, she felt more confident seeing the admiration in his gaze. Her heart swelled in her chest even as a smile curved her mouth. She didn't once return her gaze to the sheet music, instead playing from her heart. The notes flowed easily, just as the connection between her and Jared felt natural. When the song came to an end and applause filled the room, Faith stood up and walked around the piano. For the first time in her life, she bowed and accepted the applause with a smile. Only her parents and Annie would know what a leap that was for Faith. She saw her mother dab a tear from her eye, even as her father pressed a hand to his heart. Jared stood up and walked towards her. He took her hand and brushed a kiss over the back of it before meeting her gaze. "You're even more phenomenal than I imagined." This time, when she blushed, it wasn't because of her innate shyness. It was because her heart swelled with a warmth that seemed to have reached her cheeks. Chapter 10. It was a lovely summer's afternoon as Faith climbed out of the coach, accepting Jared's waiting hand. Today was their last day together before he would board the train back west that evening. While Caleb and Annie had chosen to spend the day visiting the Old North Church, Faith had suggested she and Jared spend the afternoon in Boston Common. The park was one of the most beautiful in the country, it was said. But to Faith, it simply offered a lovely walk surrounded by greenery instead of the dirt and dust and buildings on the streets. Regardless of its gruesome history, Faith often came to walk in the Common. It was hard to believe that she had only met Jared 2 days ago, because as his hand reached for hers, it felt natural, as if holding Jared's hand was the most natural thing. She didn't find herself struggling for words in his presence, and not once did she find herself doubting his interest in her. Without being overtly forward, Jared made his attraction to her clear with only smiles and looks. "Is that where they hang the witches?" Jared asked when they walked past a few trees. "No, the great elm was where the gallows used to be. Gale storm winds destroyed it a little over 10 years ago," Faith explained. "That's good to know. I can't imagine it could have been easy for descendants of anyone who met their end there to have seen the tree still standing." Faith nodded. "I agree. So many of those trials were nothing but hogwash and Puritan beliefs." "Exactly." Jared turned to her with a smile. "Another thing we agree on." Faith laughed. "And Consuela's cooking." "Definitely. Do you think if you move out west to be my bride, you can convince Consuela to come with?" Jared asked. For a moment, Faith's heart skipped a beat. They had spent the weekend getting to know each other, and not once had either of them spoken of what would happen once Jared returned home. She finally shrugged with a half smile. "Her family is here, so I hope you can cook because I can't." Jared's laughter was as bright as the sun in the sky. His gaze caught something in the distance, and Faith smiled, knowing exactly where they were headed. He stopped beneath the statue of George Washington and turned to Faith with a look of baffled amazement. "I saw a picture of it in the paper once. I never realized it was this big." "It's big and it's tall. Simply beautiful, isn't it?" Faith admired the statue anew through Jared's eyes, from the horse's hooves to the bronze sword. When she realized Jared was no longer beside her, she turned to see him kneeling to her side. "Jared?" Faith asked, surprised. "What are you doing? You're ruining your trousers." "Then I'll buy another pair. I can't imagine I'll ever find someone as unique as you." Jared reached for her hand and smiled into her gaze. "Faith, when I planned on coming to Boston, it was to meet and to find out if the connection we shared in our letters would exist in real life. But since I first laid my eyes on you 2 days ago, I've had trouble removing them. You're everything I've prayed for, everything I've dreamed of, everything I hope to have in my future. Not a day goes by that I don't think of you, or a night I don't dream of you. Do me the honor of accepting my hand in marriage. I promise to love you and care for you until my very last breath." For the first time since she had met Jared, Faith was at a loss for words. She opened her mouth, but words wouldn't come. Her heart was racing even as a smile curved her mouth. She wasn't at a loss for words because she was anxious. Instead, her words evaporated as hope, joy, and excitement coursed through her veins. Unable to utter even yes, she simply nodded as a tear slipped over her cheek. Jared flashed her a dashing smile as he reached into his pocket. He slipped a plain gold band onto her ring finger and smiled into her eyes, for now and forever. When he stood up and pulled her into his arms, Faith finally knew where she belonged. Home was no longer a place tied to a brownstone in Boston. Home was Jared's arms. He stepped back and looked at her with a questioning gaze. "You ready to say something now?" Faith laughed as she nodded again. Yes, yes, and yes. Their laughter blended into the afternoon air as their life together began. The crescendo had finally started up, and Faith knew without a doubt it would continue playing for the rest of her life if she had Jared by her side. They continued to walk through the common, talking about nothing but their shared future. Jared spoke of the children he wanted, and Faith admitted to him that she would love to have her piano freighted there. As they walked, they fell in love even more. By the time Faith had to say goodbye, she did it with a light heart, knowing that it would only be a matter of time before she took her place on Reed Ranch as Jared's wife. Until then, she had a wedding to plan and her life belongings to pack before she left for the West, a place she never thought she'd find happiness. She all but danced home, eager to tell her parents the wonderful. Chapter 11. Faith arrived home to find both her parents waiting for her in the drawing room. Ever since leaving the train station, she couldn't seem to stop smiling. Both her parents met her with smiles of their own. "I must admit, Faith, when you said you met someone through letters, I was doubtful," her father began as he took a seat by the fire. "But Jared Reed seems to be a fine young man. Honest, hardworking, and a great addition to our family one day." Faith nodded. "I know, Father." She couldn't wait to tell her parents about the engagement, but before she could, her mother began to speak. "He's handsome as well, and the best part is, he only has eyes for you. I'm so overjoyed that my baby girl has finally found love," her mother gushed, pressing a hand to her heart. "Can you believe it, Elizabeth? All three our daughters living on ranches out west. Sooner or later, we'll need to consider moving west ourselves." John smiled at his wife. "Don't get ahead of yourself, John. He hasn't even proposed yet. The courtship is still young. A lot could still happen," Elizabeth quickly cautioned her husband. Faith cleared her throat, hoping to finally get in a word in edgewise. "Actually, Father is right. He isn't getting ahead of himself. Jared proposed this afternoon." Faith couldn't help but smile triumphantly as her mother's expression changed from cautious to one of joy and surprise. "Did you accept?" Faith nodded with a shy smile. "I did." Her father was out of his chair and enfolding her in a tight hug. "My shy little mouse finally found someone patient enough to lure you out of your hole." Faith frowned. "I wouldn't exactly call myself a mouse," her father chuckled. "She's right, John. She isn't a mouse. She's more like the duckling that became the swan. I knew the right man would coax her out of her shyness and let her blossom into the beautiful and confident young lady she is." Her mother brushed away the tears streaming over her cheeks. Faith laughed. "Mother, you're being a little dramatic, don't you think?" "Not at all," her mother argued. "I've never seen you look so happy or seem as confident. I'm truly overjoyed that you found each other." "The wedding. Will it be in Boston?" her father asked, already thinking ahead. "We haven't really discussed it, but I expect it will be in Riverview on Jared's ranch. We can make a trip of it, John. We can visit Angel and Grace and then go to the wedding together. We get to see our grandchildren." Elizabeth clapped her hands excitedly. Faith couldn't help but laugh. "While you start planning your trip west, I want to write to Angel and Grace." "You can write to them later," her father insisted, pouring her a glass of port. "First, we toast to our youngest having found love." Her father didn't use the usual port glasses. Instead, he retrieved the crystal he had inherited from his parents. The only other time Faith had seen the crystal glasses being used was when her father's boss, the owner of the bank, had come over for dinner. It baffled Faith to feel so much joy overwhelm her. She had been happy before. She had been delighted when her sisters were married. But never before had she felt as she did now. It was as if a page had been turned, and her whole future now lay open before her. The pages were blank, but they nonetheless glowed with promise. As her father handed her a glass of port, Faith heard the crescendo playing in the back of her mind, feeling as if she had finally arrived where she always wanted to be. For so long, she had dreamed of having a family and a husband that cared for her, but never had she imagined actually realizing that dream. She had come to accept that her shyness would always keep her from it. To Faith, may her love be as beautiful as her music, may her future be as blessed as this family, and may her marriage be as loving and kind as ours, John toasted, holding his glass aloft. Faith felt tears well in her eyes with emotion. Thank you, Father. She took a sip of the port and felt the warmth spread through her chest. Just like warmth had spread through her chest when Jared had asked for her hand in marriage. Just thinking of him made her long for his presence. Having downed their toast, Faith headed upstairs to write a letter. But not to her sisters. They could wait. First, she wanted to write to Jared. She wanted him to have a letter to remind him of what they had shared in Boston when he arrived home in Riverview. My dearest Jared, I hope your train journey was pleasant. I wasn't sure what to expect when you arrived in Boston. At first, I was afraid that you would be disappointed once you met me in person. I wasn't expecting to fall in love or to find myself dreaming of a future with you. When you asked for my hand this afternoon, I realized I had never felt more joy in my entire life. I look forward to becoming your wife. I look very much forward to the life we will share and the family we will one day have. My parents were overjoyed with the news and instantly gave their blessing for our union. They are already planning their trip west and plan to visit my sisters while there. I wait to hear from you about the arrangements for the wedding. I can't wait to join you on Reed Ranch. Yours truly, Faith. Faith folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. She would mail it in the morning along with the letters to her sisters. But for now, she was emotionally exhausted. And if she was honest, she was eager to get to bed, hoping that her sleep would be filled with dreams of Jared Reed. Chapter 12. Oh, Annie, I'm so glad you've come, Faith exclaimed as soon as she opened the door. Just like Jared, Caleb had proposed on their last day in Boston. Faith was overjoyed to know that not only had her best friend also found true love, but that they would move west together and raise their children side by side. Me too. We have so much to discuss. Have you heard from Jared since he left? Annie asked as they moved towards the drawing room where tea and treats were waiting for them. Yes, I received word from him last week. He's just as excited about the wedding. He mentioned a date late in July. I hope to travel to Riverview before then. Faith poured them each a cup of tea and offered Annie the macaroons. Caleb mentioned a date early in August, but Jared is being so kind. Instead of me having to move into the bunkhouse with Caleb until he purchases his own ground, Jared has offered to build us a house on the ranch and allow Caleb to buy shares in the current herd. Annie's eyes lit up with excitement. So we're going to be neighbors, forever, Faith laughed. That's wonderful news, Annie. I'm so happy for you. Have you thought about a dress yet? My mother has offered me her wedding dress. It's not much, but it's beautiful in its simplicity. Annie reached for another macaroon. Yes, I have thought about it. Mother offered to take me shopping next week. Goodness, you realize that means we only have a few weeks left in Boston? Faith asked, letting out an anxious sigh. She looked around the drawing room before her eyes rested on the piano. I never thought I'd ever leave. I know, isn't it exciting? Your sisters must have been overjoyed to learn about the engagement. Very much. Angel insisted that we visit each other at least once a month. Grace is simply concerned about my wardrobe. Annie chuckled. That's Grace for you. One would think now that she's living on a ranch that she's given up her love for fashion. Not at all. She's not as concerned with fashion anymore. Instead, she advised me to purchase a few plain dresses and a few pairs of trousers. Can you believe Grace wearing trousers? Faith chuckled. So much has changed over the last few years, and so much is yet to change. Your parents are going to be awfully lonely here without you and your sisters. Faith nodded. Yes, they are. Father is already speaking about retirement. They're considering moving west as well. Mother insists that she needs to be closer to her grandchildren. Annie reached for Faith's hands and met her gaze. You're going to make a wonderful mother, Faith. You too, Annie. Faith smiled mysteriously. I've actually thought about what I will name my first daughter. You have? Do tell? Annie encouraged her. May, Faith said with a smile, because of the month in which I met Jared. That's lovely, Annie nodded. Just look at you, Faith. You've completely blossomed. Aren't you glad that I went against your wishes and asked Caleb to tell Jared about you? Faith laughed. I've never been more grateful, Annie. Faith's laughter sobered as she met her friend's gaze. You've always known how to coax me out of my shell. In some ways, I think you know me better than most. I value your friendship very highly. Don't do that. We'll both be in tears, and this is a happy time. A time for celebration and laughter, Annie teased. I value your friendship as well, Faith. Faith's heart swelled with love and admiration for her best friend. She felt blessed that the Lord had given her someone as kind and as faithful as Annie as a friend. Annie's laughter filled the air with joy. We should pray that we have our children at the same time, the very same day if possible. Imagine our little girls running through the fields with bonnets on their heads. May will wear a yellow dress and your daughter a pink one. They will be best friends, just like us. Faith joined in the excitement. And if we have sons, they will be best friends too, just like Jared and Caleb, Annie gushed. Faith couldn't remember the last time she had so much fun. While they drank tea, they dreamed about their futures in the West. By the time Annie left, Faith wished it was already late July. Just this morning, it had felt too far away, but now she could only hope for time to fly faster. She was eager for her new life to start, her life with Jared. Chapter 13. Faith woke up coughing. She gasped for breath, but it was as if she simply couldn't fill her lungs with oxygen. Fear began to crawl up her spine as she continued to cough. She reached for the match to light the candle on her bedside table when she realized a strange smell had filled her room. Groggy, she managed to light the candle only to feel her breath catch in her throat. The reason she couldn't breathe was the same reason she couldn't see further than her door. Smoke, thick, pungent, and suffocating smoke was billowing into her room. At first, Faith wasn't sure what was happening until she heard the sound. Smoke wasn't supposed to have a sound, was it? She threw back the covers and picked up the candle, determined to find out what the noise was. As she moved closer to the door, she could see the glow coming from downstairs. The flames licked at the bottom of the stairs as if they were crawling their way toward the first floor. A cry of fear escaped Faith as she rushed to her parents' room. She flung the door open and almost ran straight into her father. Fire! There's a fire downstairs! Her father nodded, his eyes wide with fear. We need to get out of the house. But how? Her mother asked sleepily. Elizabeth, it doesn't matter how. It matters that we get out before the entire house goes up in flames, John barked before he rushed past Faith into the hallway. Faith ran after her father and managed to grab him before he could descend the stairs. It's already coming up, Father. We can't go down. We'll be scorched alive. Her father dragged a hand through his hair, his eyes wide with fear. We need to find another way out. Faith followed him back to the master bedroom, where he opened the window for fresh air. Faith joined him and stuck her head out to gasp for fresh air before she turned to her father. What shall we do? Her father ripped a sheet off the bed and began to wet it with water from the wash basin and jug. Help me wet this. The noise was growing louder with the hissing of the flames, the splitting of wood, and the groaning of the floor as flames consumed it from beneath. Faith could feel the heat beneath her feet. It made her even more terrified that they wouldn't be able to escape. Faith did as she was told. She dunked the sheet into the small body of water until there wasn't a single drop left. The sheet was soaked. She turned to her father with confusion in her eyes. Here. Her father stepped forward and began to wrap the wet sheet around Faith. The cold sheet made her shiver even as she shook her head. Father, what are you doing? You're going to listen to me, Faith. You hear me, her father said firmly. I need you to be brave. I need you to put on your shoes and then run downstairs as fast as your feet can carry you." "But the fire, I'll burn," Faith cried out with fear as tears began to fill her eyes. "The sheet will protect you. You just have to run fast, Faith. As fast as you can, down the stairs and right out the front door, you hear?" Her father demanded firmly with his hands on her shoulders. "But what about you and Mother?" Faith asked, glancing at her mother standing a few feet from her. "We'll find more water. We'll be right behind you. Run, Faith. Run now," her father said, pushing her towards the door. Faith glanced at her father, not wanting to leave them behind. "Go on. We'll be right down," her mother encouraged her. Faith nodded, determined to do as she was told. She rushed to her room and pulled on her shoes without bothering with stockings, and then she ran towards the landing of the stairs. The flames had already started to lick at the walls with tongues long and yellow as they lit up everything they touched. She drew in a deep breath and began to run. She closed her eyes, afraid that if she saw the fiery monster, she would lose her courage. At the foot of the stairs, she opened her eyes and felt her heart skip a beat with terror. The noise, she found it. A raging fire was blazing through their home. Every surface visible through the thick smoke and flames was alight. Even through the wet sheet, Faith could feel the heat of the fire. She held her head down and pulled the sheet tighter around her as she ran for the front door. Just a few feet from the front door, she stopped in front of a line of fire. She glanced back towards the staircase but couldn't see her parents. For a moment she considered running back to them, but the heat had already started to dry the sheet. If she ran back upstairs now, the sheet would catch fire. Lowering her head, Faith dragged in a deep breath and closed her eyes as she jumped through the line of fire. She reached for the doorknob and let out a cry of pain. It was as hot as a pressing iron. Without thinking, Faith bundled the skirts of her nightdress into her hand and reached for it again. She turned it and flung the door open, and then she ran out into the street. Gasping for breath, sweat and soot covered her face. She leaned over, resting her hands on her knees to catch her breath. A coughing fit overcame her even as she heard onlookers gather around her. "Is anyone in there?" a man asked, running towards Faith. Faith nodded. "My parents." Oxygen finally reached her lungs, giving her the strength to look up. The sight before her was like nothing Faith had ever seen before. Flames had broken the windows. It was all but consuming their home. She looked up towards her parents' bedroom and let out a sigh of relief when she saw them covered with sheets. Before Faith could pray for her parents to escape safely, the noise became louder, and the heat caused an explosion. Faith could see the house collapse into itself, even as the smoke turned a different color. "Mother, Father," she cried out, rushing towards the front door. Someone grabbed her by the shoulders. Later, she would realize it was a neighbor who held her back with the strength of a lion. "It's too late. It's too late." Faith shook her head as she fell to the sidewalk, tears streaming over her face. "It can't be. They're on their way." The neighbor held her close and began to rock her back and forth as men rushed toward the house with buckets of water. Chapter 14. Faith wasn't sure how long it took them to control the fire, but by the time they were done, the sun was touching the horizon. She turned to the person sitting beside her with a questioning look. "My parents?" The neighbor shook his head with empathy. "I'm sorry, Faith. They didn't make it out in time. They only made it to the foot of the stairs." If Faith had only experienced overwhelming joy for the first time a few weeks ago, she now experienced the opposite. Her heart tore into a million pieces as she began to weep. Surrounded by firefighters, neighbors, and curious onlookers, Faith felt all alone in her grief. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and not even a dress to her name. She looked at the wreckage that remained of the house she knew as home, now reduced to rubble and ashes, and felt another wave of grief overcome her. It was as if she was in a dream, just waiting to wake from the horrors that faced her. She closed her eyes and wished herself awake, but wakefulness wouldn't come. Instead, she remained stuck in a nightmare from which she couldn't escape. Tears kept quietly streaming down her face as the crowd began to disperse. Some pitied her with words of condolence, others rushed home to prepare for the workday ahead. For them, it was just another day, not the day on which they had lost everything that had ever mattered to them. Someone set down a cup of tea in front of her, and someone had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. But Faith wouldn't recall their faces or their names. All she would remember of this night and the morning that followed was feeling lost and all alone. "Come on, dearie. You need to get cleaned up. You can't just keep sitting here all on your own." A woman with a Cockney accent pulled Faith up by the shoulders. Only once she stood did Faith realize how small and old the lady was. I'll manage." Her voice sounded gravely from the smoke inhalation, her throat burning from it. "Nonsense, you're staying with me," the lady insisted as she tried to hush Faith along the sidewalk. Faith was about to argue when she heard someone call her name. She turned to see Annie running towards her. Faith didn't even realize she was running until she slammed her body full speed into Annie's waiting arms. She wept without pause, a new wave of grief washing over her. She wasn't sure when the old Cockney lady had joined them, but as she explained to Annie the events of hours before, Faith could do nothing but weep. When they were finally alone, Annie brushed her hand over Faith's hair. There, it will be all right. I promise." Faith knew her friend was saying the one thing everyone turned to when they didn't know how to react to disaster or death. The words were heartfelt, but did nothing to ease Faith's grief. She wasn't sure how long they stood there, but finally it felt as if Faith was drained of all moisture. Her throat was burning with thirst, her eyes red and swollen from the crying and the smoke. She pulled back and met Annie's sympathetic gaze. "I need water." Annie smiled at her affectionately. "You need a lot more than that, but let's start with the water." Annie held on to Faith's shoulders as she walked her home. Faith was grateful that she didn't have to see Annie's parents when they arrived. As if she were a child, Annie guided her upstairs and soon enough had a bath drawn for her. She bathed her, washed her hair, and kept refilling the glass in Faith's hand. By the time Faith was clean and her thirst quenched, Annie led her to her bed and pulled back the covers. "You rest for a while, and when you wake up, we'll take it from there." Faith was too exhausted to even argue. She fell into a deep sleep. As if her life had just reversed, her dreams brought her relief from the nightmare she had just lived. She was having dinner with her parents, and they were laughing over something Angel had written in her letters. Suddenly, she felt the familiar heat and saw the fiery glow. Her heart stopped as she began to shout for everyone to get out before the fire claimed them. Faith, you're safe? It's me, Annie." Annie's voice dragged her out of the dream. Faith blinked her eyes a few times and began to weep. The reality was worse than the dream. There. Annie soothed her as she brushed a hand over her hair. "I sent a telegram to your sisters, and I've arranged for the hospital to keep your parents until your sisters arrive." Faith frowned before hope sparked in her eyes. Only then did the word funeral enter her mind. Her parents weren't at the hospital because there was hope of recovery. They were simply there because that's where corpses were kept until funeral arrangements had been made. Without saying a word, the tears began to roll over her cheeks again. If there had ever been a loss greater, Faith didn't know it. Chapter 15. Angel stepped off the train and felt the wave of grief overcome her. The last time she had been in Boston, she had spent time with her parents. She had slept in her childhood room, and she had been so eager to escape. She reached for Grace's hand and smiled at her sister with sympathy. "We'll get through this. At least we had each other." Grace nodded. "I can't imagine how hard it must have been for Faith. At least we're here now." Angel nodded. It was the first time both she and Grace had left their children. Angel knew that their children would be cared for by their fathers, but it still didn't ease the separation anxiety. But this wasn't a journey Angel wanted to expose her child to. There would be a funeral, the arrangements for the house, and then, of course, trying to save whatever could be salvaged. It would be emotional, heart-wrenching, and devastating. The last thing Angel needed was to run after her son when she needed to be strong for her sisters. Once they had retrieved their baggage, Grace arranged for a coach. Angel was grateful that Travis had given them enough money for the journey and the impending expenses that she didn't have to trudge to Annie's house with her luggage. As the coach drove through Boston, Angel couldn't help but remember how trapped she had felt there. She remembered how she had been eager to leave, not for love, but the prospect of a career. The harsh reality of her visit only struck her now. If Faith agreed to return with them to Travis's ranch, this would be her last time in Boston. She gasped quietly, realizing that all her childhood memories and memories of her parents would remain here in Boston. She bit back the tears that welled in her eyes and quickly turned to Grace. "How are you holding up?" Grace shrugged. "Horribly." A tear slipped over Grace's cheek as the coach stopped in front of the Brooks home. "Come on, let's go find Faith." Angel opened the door, hoping she looked stronger than she felt. They were welcomed by Annie and her parents, but Faith was nowhere to be seen. "She's upstairs." Annie let out a heavy sigh. "She hasn't left the room since it happened. She's not eating or really sleeping. Annie sniffed. "She just sits there staring at the wall." "We're here now," Angel said almost to herself, as if convincing herself that Faith just needed family. "Come, I'll take you to her," Annie offered. Angel and Grace followed Annie up the 2 flights of stairs to the 2nd floor. Annie knocked on a door and gently opened it. Angel smiled gratefully at Annie. "Thank you for everything." "I only wish I could have done more," Annie said with a sad smile. Angel had meant what she had said. As well as taking Faith in and supporting her, Annie and her parents had made the funeral arrangements. Their parents would be buried tomorrow morning at a private service, caskets closed. "Faith," Angel said quietly as she walked into the room. Faith's eyes didn't move. She kept staring straight ahead. Fear clutched at Angel's heart. They had just lost their parents. They couldn't lose Faith as well. Angel moved towards the bed and took a seat beside Faith. She gently rested her hand on Faith's shoulder. "I'm so sorry we couldn't be here sooner." Faith didn't move. She barely reacted. Grace sat down on her other side. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Faith. I can't imagine how horrifying it must have been for you." Still, Faith didn't move. Angel met Grace's gaze and shook her head, fear coloring her eyes. Angel drew in a deep breath and let it out quietly. "Faith, you have to talk to us. We're worried about you." "The funeral is tomorrow and there are things we need to discuss." It was as if the dam broke. Faith began to weep. Heartfelt sobs poured out of her as if she had been keeping them in for too long. Angel held her as she cried, but soon Faith pulled away. "It's all my fault," Faith cried out, brushing away her tears. "You don't have to forgive me. I know I wouldn't have." "What?" Angel asked, confused. "Faith, what are you talking about?" "It's my fault. I should have woken up sooner. I should have waited for my mother and father. I shouldn't have left without them. It's my fault that they didn't make it out in time." Devastation racked Faith. Angel's heart clenched in her chest for her younger sister. Annie had given them the facts of what had happened that night, and there had been nothing Faith could have done to save their parents. Being a parent herself, Angel understood why her parents had ushered Faith out first. She wrapped her arms around Faith and held her tight. "There's nothing to forgive, Faith. It wasn't your fault. You couldn't do anything, save run into the fire after them, and then we would have lost you as well." Grace nodded. "She's right, Faith. It wasn't your fault. We're just grateful you survived. It must have been horrible. We don't blame you. We're just glad that you were saved." "Saved for what?" Faith asked gruffly. "To spend the rest of my life reliving the night I couldn't save my parents? To have nightmares every time I sleep about the flames eating away our childhood as if it hadn't fed in years? Or was I saved simply to spend every day remembering what I lost that night?" Angel didn't respond. It was clear Faith had been caught up in her own misery and grief for too long. She had allowed her mind to spin out of control. She wouldn't argue with her now. What Faith needed was support and love, not a speech. She held Faith closer and hugged her. "We're together now. Together we'll get through this." Grace smiled at Angel. "Together we'll remember them and always cherish the memories we have of them." Together the 3 sisters wept over the loss of their parents. Angel had known coming to Boston to bury her parents would be hard, but not once had she imagined how the disaster had affected Faith. Her sister, who had always been shy and frail, now seemed to have molded into an anxious wreck filled with guilt. Angel knew they had a long road ahead of them, but first they needed to bury their mother and their father. Chapter 16. Faith felt hollow. It felt as if someone had scooped out her heart and burned it in the fire along with her parents and everything that had ever mattered to her. Her sisters tried to coax her to eat, but every time food touched her stomach, it would come right back up again. Angel was kind and supportive, but Grace seemed a little irritable at Faith's response to her parents' passing. Faith couldn't even blame her, not even she had known that such a tragedy would rip her soul from her body and leave her wishing she hadn't escaped the fire. She climbed out of bed and looked out the window. The sun was shining, and the flowers in the window box were in full bloom. The beautiful weather and joyful flowers seemed almost to insult the grief that the day would hold. Faith turned away from the window and began to dress. She wasn't sure how the dress had materialized since Faith owned nothing, but the black satin dress fit her perfectly. The lace veil hid her gaunt expression, and hopefully would hide her tears as well. Drawing in a deep breath, Faith prayed for strength to face the day before she opened the door and headed downstairs. Grace, Angel, and Annie were waiting for her in the dining room, along with Annie's parents. Angel moved towards her and hugged her tightly. "We'll get through this, I promise." Faith nodded, not feeling up to either agreeing or arguing with her oldest sister. "Annie was kind enough to secure a tomb for Mother and Father," Grace commented. "It's a good thing, at least then you know they wouldn't be disturbed in future. It's simply atrocious how graves were moved for the new underground train." Mrs. Book shook her head with disappointment. "It's been decided the remains would be moved to a mass grave." Mr. Brooke sighed heavily. When the construction began for the underground train between Park Street and Boylston Station, numerous remains had been disinterred. It had been the source of numerous front-page stories in Boston for more than a year. Faith had sympathized with the plight of the families whose relatives' remains were moved, but now it seemed inconsequential compared to what she had to face today. At first, everyone refused to make use of the train, but now it's running numerous times a day. Mrs. Brooks sighed. Angel reached for Faith's hand. "That won't happen to Mother and Father." "We best get going," Grace reminded everyone as she pulled on her black satin gloves. Faith didn't remember their journey to the King's Chapel burial ground or the conversation that took place on the coach. All she could think about was how she had escaped and her parents hadn't. The guilt overwhelmed her, regardless of Faith and Grace's insistence that it wasn't her fault. If only Faith knew what had started the fire. With the sun shining and the birds chirping in the trees, they met the bishop at the site where her parents would be buried. At the sight of the two coffins, Faith felt her knees quiver beneath her weight. With her sisters beside her, the bishop began a short sermon for her parents and all those gathered. His words were kind and gentle, referring to her parents as contributing members of society and loving parents. He finished the short sermon with a verse that Faith knew she would never forget. 2 Corinthians 5:8. "We would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord." For the first time since losing her parents, Faith felt some consolation. She yearned to join her parents, regardless. She too would rather be away from her body and at home with her parents and the Lord than standing over their graves. Angel scooped up a hand of dirt and gently sprinkled it over the coffins. Grace followed. Faith simply couldn't bear to do the same. Instead, she reached for the necklace around her neck, one that had been given to her for her 16th birthday, and laid it on her mother's coffin. "I will always remember." She moved to her father's coffin and pulled off one of her gloves and laid it on the coffin. "For the helping hand you always so readily offered." She stood back, not a single tear in her eyes. She was emptied of her tears and now filled with hollow grief instead. For a while they stood aside as the funeral attendees left, from their neighbors to her father's colleagues at the bank. When it was only the three of them left, Angel took Faith and Grace's hands. "We will never forget, and we will make sure our children remember what wonderful grandparents they had." Faith nodded, wishing she could be anywhere but here in this nightmare that wouldn't seem to give her any relief. The lawyer is waiting for us. Grace checked the time on her pocket watch. Faith frowned as she turned to her sister. Lawyer? Angel nodded. Yes, we need to go over Father's will with the lawyer. But why? There's nothing left from the fire. Faith shook her head. Faith, Father might have had investments with the bank. We need to meet with him. Faith understood that certain things needed to be done when someone passed away, but seeing a lawyer wasn't one of them. She didn't care what her father had left them. She only wished he was still alive. She glanced at her sisters and frowned at their calm grief. She envied them. Why didn't they seem as devastated as she was? Why couldn't she accept that all things happened according to the will of God, and as his servant it was her duty to accept it? She let out a heavy sigh before she followed her sisters out of the burial grounds. Chapter 17. Before we leave tomorrow, there is a lot that needs to be done, Angel said over breakfast. The Brooke family had all departed on their separate chores for the day, leaving the Jones sisters to wrap up their business in Boston. I don't think I should go with you. Faith trailed off quietly as she pushed the food around on her plate. Of course you're coming with us. It's not up for discussion, Grace said simply. Faith let out a heavy sigh. Just because she had just suffered a terrible trauma didn't mean she was obtuse. She understood she had nowhere to go, but she didn't want to become a burden to her sisters now that her parents were gone. With the money they had inherited from her father's investments, she could buy her own small apartment in Boston. Although Faith knew that Boston would never be the same again without her family there. Grace is right. We should stay together. The best place for you is Scott Ranch. You can spend some time with your niece and nephew, and it's close enough for you to continue courting Jared. Angel began making a list. We need to go shopping today. Although Annie's been very kind in lending you whatever you have needed, you need your own. Everything from suspenders and hats, right down to shoes and dresses. Practicalities. Faith nodded. Although she didn't want to deal with the practicalities of their situation, she didn't really have a choice. Can we go by the house? There's nothing, Angel said gently. Grace and I have already been. What the fire didn't reduce to ashes is damaged beyond repair. My piano? Faith asked, as her eyes darted between Grace and Angel. The first thing we hope to salvage, it won't ever be the same. You can buy a new one. Grace spoke of the piano as if it were a mere instrument. She didn't understand that to Faith it had been so much more. It had been her best friend, her ally, and in times of need, the best company she could ask for. I still want to go by the house, Faith said stubbornly. Before she left with her sisters, she needed to find closure. Closure for what had happened that dreadful night. She needed to see for herself that there was nothing she could have done to save her parents. Then we'll go by the house when we're done shopping, Grace agreed. You should write to Jared. Tell him about the fire and that you're moving out west. Faith shrugged. Maybe later. Faith hadn't expected a day of shopping to lift her spirits, but it did. For the first time since the fire, she was too distracted to even remember all she had lost. She found herself indulging in beautiful dresses and hats, allowing her sisters to choose bold colors. Faith preferred muted pastels, but Angel insisted the sapphire dress brought out her eyes. As soon as they arrived at the site of their house, Faith felt the grief overwhelm her again. She couldn't help but relive that night. She stood in front of the house and tried to see any other way they could have escaped, apart from via the stairs. But the truth of the matter was, there had been no other way for them to escape. Jumping from the windows into the fire below would have been just as devastating. Overcome with loss, she moved into the decrepit building. She could see the remnants of the stairs and where her parents had been found. She quickly looked away to where the walls had been burned down to the ground. In the corner, where the drawing room used to be, was what was left of her piano. It made her heart break to see it scorched and burned beyond recognition. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of the chair. The chair had been burned, but the seat seemed to have remained closed. With hope blooming in her chest, Faith rushed through the rubble and ashes towards the chair. Careful, Faith. The floor could be unstable, Angel cautioned her. Faith ripped the seat open of the piano stool and felt relief wash over her to see her folders inside. She pulled them out and held them to her chest as her sisters rushed to her side. Your music? Did it survive the fire? Faith nodded. Yes, the corners are a little scorched, but mostly the sheets seem intact. Thank heavens. Grace sighed gratefully. They scoured the ashes for a little longer, but it was just as Grace and Angel had said. There was nothing left to salvage. All that was left her of childhood home now were the memories she would forever hold dear. They returned to the Brooke home for their last dinner with Annie's family. Faith tried to contribute to the dinner conversation, but she found herself retreating once again. The confidence she had gained through meeting Jared and falling in love had suddenly vanished. Instead, Faith wished she could disappear between the floorboards and never have to look another person in the eyes ever again. Surely that would relieve her of the pitying looks. It was bad enough that she recalled the events of that night numerous times a day. She didn't need others looking at her with sympathy to remind her what had happened. She retreated to her bedroom where she packed all her new dresses, wondering if her sisters thought they would excite her about her new life in Indiana. The dresses were only a reminder of what she had lost. Chapter 18. Jared hadn't heard from Faith in almost a month. This was the first time since their correspondence began that his letters went unanswered. He couldn't allow himself to even consider that Faith no longer wanted to be his wife. Instead, he patiently waited for her to write to him. He sent her a letter every day, expressing his concern and telling her how excited he was about their shared future. When he had gone into town this morning to purchase feed for the chickens, he had been pleasantly surprised to receive a letter. Only on closer inspection did he realize the letter wasn't from Faith. Curiosity had him opening the letter as soon as he returned to the wagon. Dear Jared, this is Angel Scott, Faith's eldest sister. I hope you don't mind my forwardness in reaching out to you, but I thought it was best you be informed of recent events. Since you last heard from Faith, a terrible tragedy has befallen our family. On the evening of the 28th of May, a fire broke out in my parents' home in Boston. My father, who had always been adept at thinking in emergencies, cloaked Faith in a drenched sheet before urging her out of the house. Unfortunately, the fire became overwhelming and our parents were unable to escape the all-consuming flames. As you can imagine, this tragedy has truly saddened us all, but Faith most of all. It seems Faith blames herself for surviving, for not being able to save our parents, and for not waking sooner. She simply hasn't been herself since the tragedy, as I am sure you can well understand. When it came to my attention that she has yet to reply to your letters, I simply knew I had to reach out. Faith is no longer residing in Boston. She now lives with my husband Travis Scott and me until further notice. You can write to her at the address on the back of the envelope. I will make sure she receives your correspondence. It is truly heartbreaking to know that just a few short weeks ago, Faith was excited about the wedding and the life that awaited her with you, whereas now, nothing seems to brighten the shadows of grief in her gaze. I hope you are the man my father thought you to be, and that you will support Faith during this difficult time. A word to the wise: do not let Faith shut you out. She will try, but do not let her. I know what happiness you bring her and truly hope that she can move past this grief with your support to embrace that happiness again. Kindest regards, Angel Scott. Jared read the letter again and felt a wave of grief rush over him. While he had been doubting Faith's commitment to him, she had been facing the worst disaster and loss of her life. He wished he could draw her into his arms and assure her that everything would be all right. He wanted to console her and be a shoulder to lean on. For a moment, he hesitated to write to her. What if she did no longer have interest in marrying him? What if this tragedy had made her feel differently about him? Jared pushed all doubts aside and reached for the reins. He wouldn't let her shut him out. He would abide by her sister's advice and make sure that Faith knew that he cared. As he began to drive the wagon loaded with feed home, he began to word his letter to Faith in his mind. My dearest beloved, Over the course of the last few weeks, I found myself doubting if you still remained faithful to our commitment when I didn't hear from you. How wrong I was. I've just learned of the tragedy that claimed the lives of your parents and your family home. I can't imagine how hard it must be to suffer such a devastating loss. There are no words that will ease the grief you must be feeling, but hopefully I can attempt to give you consolation. During the brief time I spent with your parents, it was clear they adored you. They were kind, generous, and caring, and most of all, welcoming to both me and Caleb. I will also remember them for that. I am certain that to know that your parents are now looking down on you from heaven does nothing to ease your grief, but I assure you they wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your days drowning in guilt and grief. Instead, embrace the life you still have to live, a life they can no longer join in. They would have wanted you to be happy, to have a family, and to look to the future with hope, not the past with grief. The fire might have stolen your parents, your beloved childhood home, and your valued items, but it didn't take your memories, Faith. Turn to your memories in times of grief and be reminded of how blessed you were to have such wonderful parents. I will remember them always. I wish I could comfort you during this difficult time, as I wish I could have been there to support you. I would have traveled north to stand by your side in a heartbeat had I known. Please write to me, Faith. Tell me what I can do to support you. It is a man's duty to care for, protect, and honor his wife. Let me have that privilege now. My deepest condolences and fondest affections, Jared. Jared never traveled into town more than was necessary, but as soon as he arrived home, he penned the letter and saddled his horse. He wouldn't delay sending this letter to his beloved Faith for another minute. Chapter 19. 6 weeks after the tragedy of the fire, Faith sat in a field surrounded by wildflowers. She held her face up to the sun and wondered if she would ever be able to feel the joy again that she had felt when she had walked through Boston Common with Jared. Her feelings for Jared hadn't changed in the least, but she had. The fire had changed her irrevocably. It had left her with so much guilt that she couldn't seem to move on with her life. The only time she felt relief from the heavy clouds hanging over her was when she was with her niece and nephew. But even then, she would feel the guilt rush over her immediately afterward, knowing that her parents would never have that privilege. Angel tried her best to understand, but Faith couldn't simply move on from her guilt, as Angel suggested. Every day was a struggle. It was a struggle for Faith to convince herself to get out of bed and dress in one of the new dresses they had bought in Boston. Dresses bought with the money her father had left them, as if money could ever replace his presence. She would struggle through the day as she watched what a wonderful mother Angel had become and how much love there was in her family. She would struggle through the chores, every single chore, a reminder that this wasn't her home. She felt obliged to do as much as possible so that Travis and his mother wouldn't think of her as taking advantage of their hospitality. A heavy sigh escaped her as she looked up at the cloudless sky. The brightness of the sun made her eyelids flutter closed before she began to pray. Praying was the only thing that helped her these days. It helped her to get a little perspective, but mostly it gave her someone to talk to. She couldn't admit to her sisters what she could admit to the Lord. She couldn't tell Jared that she didn't feel as if she deserved happiness. Dear Lord, I hope you are up there today because I need you to give me strength. Everyone says I should move on, Lord, but moving on means forgetting my parents, forgetting that night. How will I ever forget that night? Lord, I need your wisdom to guide me on the way forward. I can afford to get a place of my own, but I know my sisters will be offended. I receive the letters that Jared writes to me, but how can respond when I know I'm no longer the same girl with whom he walked through Boston Common? Please, Lord, help me. Give me guidance and strength, and help me find a way to move on and accept the tragedy that took my parents. I beg of you. Faith stopped mid-prayer at the sound of her name. Faith? When she heard say her name called again, she turned around and was surprised to see Jared standing only a few feet from her. Jared? Yes, it's me. Jared smiled kindly as he moved toward her. Faith's heart began to race. her usual shyness fighting to the surface as he took a seat beside her. She dropped her gaze into her lap, wondering why he was on Scott Ranch. "When you didn't reply to my letters, I knew I had to come," Jared explained. "Did you read them?" Faith nodded, still not meeting his gaze. Jared turned to her and lifted her chin with his finger before turning her to face him. "I've missed you, Faith." Faith didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure what he was expecting of her. "I was so sorry to learn about your parents. I wish I could have been there to support you." Faith found him searching her gaze and felt the familiar butterflies in her tummy. Her feelings for Jared hadn't changed in the least, but how could she just continue their courtship as if nothing had happened? Everything had happened. "Tell you what, you don't have to say a word. Just let me sit here with you. I promise I'll do all the talking." Jared raised a brow in question. Faith nodded, basking in his presence. How could she have known that just having Jared close would make her feel stronger? Jared leaned back on his elbows and crossed his legs at the ankles. Faith did the same, wondering what Jared was going to talk about. He surprised her by pulling a sheet of paper out of his pocket before he began to speak. "I had a feeling you might not feel like talking, so I thought I'd read you a few Bible verses instead." Jared smiled at her and began to read. "Continue encouraging each other and building each other up, just like you are doing already." 1 Thessalonians 5:11. That verse is the reason I decided to come and see you. I can't build you up or support you all the way from Riverview. Faith didn't speak. Instead, she waited for him to continue. "Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves." Romans 12:10. "My devotion to you is steadfast. Faith, you must know that I will continue visiting until you feel strong enough to face the world again. I honor your feelings, and I want to help you carry your grief." Faith felt the wave of grief rush over her, but she pushed it aside. Jared sat up and reached for her left hand. He brushed his finger over the ring that remained on her finger. "Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Mark 10:9. "We might not yet have said our vows, but to me, we were joined the day you agreed to marry me. I won't let tragedy, distance, or grief separate us from what we have." Faith met his gaze, and a tear slipped over her cheek. Before she knew it, she had succumbed to sobs. Jared pulled her into his arms and held her as she cried. He didn't try to tell her everything would be all right, that she should let it out, or even that she should look to the future. He just held her while she poured out all her emotions. When she was finally done, she leaned back and he offered her his handkerchief. Faith used it to dry her cheeks. Jared smiled at her warmly. "We have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. That is where your parents are, Faith. Remember that in the darkest times. They didn't remain in that blaze. Their souls were simply called home. God has a plan for all of us, and although you might want to believe it was your fault that they weren't saved, just remember calling them home was part of God's plan as well." Faith blinked twice at his words, and a frown creased her brow. "You really think the fire was part of God's plan?" Jared felt hope spark in his chest and nodded. "Just like finding you was part of God's plan. We don't always understand his acts, Faith, but we must trust in his will, for he has plans to prosper us, not to harm us." Faith smiled weakly. "Thank you for coming, Jared. I'll understand if you don't want to make the journey again." Jared chuckled and shook his head. "Clearly you have been a little out of touch. Annie has arrived in Riverview. Between her and Caleb setting up house and planning their wedding, I'm grateful for the escape. Can I visit you again next week, perhaps? Perhaps we can even go on a picnic?" Faith hesitated for a moment before she nodded. She wasn't sure if she still wanted to marry Jared and if she wanted to move away from the only family she had left. But she did know that spending time with Jared had been more consoling than any other activity in the last 6 weeks. "I'd like that very much." Chapter 20. "I see Jared came to visit again today," Angel commented over dinner. Faith shrugged. "Yes, he did. I'm glad. He seems like a really nice man. I can see why Mother and Father approved of him." Angel cut into her meat without even noticing how mentioning her parents had upset Faith. "Wasn't the wedding supposed to be today?" Travis asked, turning to Faith. Faith let out a sigh and dropped her fork. Yes. I'm so sorry, Faith. I'm sure it must have been a difficult day for you. How is Jared taking postponing the wedding? Faith frowned as she turned to her sister. Who said the wedding was being postponed? How can you even think of weddings at a time like this? You and Grace both carry on as if they didn't exist. They did. Faith stood up from the table and rushed to her room. She had been so happy to see Jared today, but once he left, she felt guilty about her joy. She found herself thinking of the past, when families would be in mourning for years or more, but in her family, it seemed everyone just wanted to move on with their own lives. Faith wasn't going to do that. There was a soft knock at the door before Angel's head peered around the door. Can I come in? It's your house, Faith reminded her. It's your home for as long as you like, Angel countered as she took a seat beside Faith on the bed. For a moment they sat in silence until Angel finally spoke. It might seem to you that Grace and I are not mourning, but we can't just think of ourselves, Faith. We need to think of our children, our families, and our responsibilities. What will become of little Jacob if I gave myself over to my grief? Death is a natural part of life, and we have no choice but to accept it. It might sound harsh, but you know as well as I do that it's the truth. I can't. I keep remembering that night and sitting on the sidewalk. I should have run back. I should have. Faith began, but Angel shook her head firmly. This world is filled with sin, anger, envy, gluttony, greed, lust, and pride, Angel began. You forgot sloth, Faith said with a weak smile. Her mother had made certain all her daughters knew the 7 deadly sins before they even turned 5. Right, and sloth. Would you rather our parents spend their old age in this world simply because we're selfish and want them to bring joy to our lives? Or would we rather they rest peacefully in heaven? That's not fair. If you put it like that, you make my grief sound unfounded, Faith argued. No, I'm simply saying they are in a better place. Not once have you asked me how I deal with my grief, Angel said gently. Faith turned to her sister and frowned an apology. I'm sorry, Angel. I just thought. You seemed fine. Of course I'm not fine, Angel said impatiently. I lost my parents, and I didn't even have a chance to say goodbye. My baby sister was there to witness the tragedy, and I feel helpless to help her process her grief. I'm sorry. Faith trailed off. For a moment, silence hung in the room before Faith turned to Angel. How do you deal with your grief? Angel smiled dreamily. I read Revelations. I memorize my favorite passages. Whenever I feel overcome with grief, I simply remind myself of the wonderful eternal world that our mother and father now reside in. Streets paved of gold? Faith asked suspiciously. Exactly. Rivers of water, clear as crystal, that hold life. 12 gates with 12 pearls. Streets made of gold, pure as transparent glass. And the best thing about heaven is the presence of our Lord and Savior. It's only temporary, Faith. We'll see them again when our time comes. Then, of course, there is Isaiah 57. Angel smiled and let out a quiet sigh. I can't recall it from memory, Faith admitted. Good people pass away. The godly often die before their time. But no one seems to care or wonder why. No one seems to understand that God is protecting them from the evil to come. For those that follow godly paths will rest in peace when they die. Angel drew in a deep breath. I can't believe I've memorized it. Very impressive, Faith chuckled. So according to Isaiah, the godly die before their time because God is protecting them from evil to come? Exactly, Angel nodded. So instead of grieving their passing, celebrate that they were called home before they had to face more sin and evil to come. Angel pressed a kiss to Faith's head and stood up. Just remember, Faith, Mother and Father would have wanted us to be happy and to rejoice in the memories we have of them. They wouldn't have wanted us to drown in our grief. Faith sighed when Angel left the room. She knew her sister was right. She just wasn't sure she would ever be strong enough to accept God's will. Chapter 21. Between building the new cabin for Annie and Caleb and being a full-time rancher, it had been 3 weeks since Jared had been able to visit Scott Ranch. He missed Faith and wished that she was there with him where he could take care of her. But ever since the tragedy, neither of them had broached the subject of their wedding. Faith was still quiet on his last visit, hardly saying anything at all. But every now and then she would smile at him with shadows in her eyes, but at least her smile gave him hope. Enough hope that he kept on praying and dreaming about their future together. When he had sent the invitation for Faith's whole family to attend Annie and Caleb's wedding, he had once again not expected a response. But to his surprise, he had received a telegram informing him that the whole family would be in attendance. It was only dawn, but Jared was already out and about, trying to get everything done before the ceremony later that morning. Along with the help of a few ranch hands, they had moved the furniture into Caleb's new cabin the day before and tested the wood stove. Tonight, Caleb would be a married man, Jared thought with a heavy sigh. How he wished it could have been him instead. As he began to carry chairs to the field where the ceremony would take place, Jared thought about Faith. He thought about her as he picked wildflowers for the bride's bouquet, and even when the first guests began to arrive. Since her arrival in Riverview, Annie had been staying at a boarding house in town. Tonight would be her first night on the ranch, and Caleb and Jared wanted to make sure that she felt at home. He was truly happy that Caleb had found love, but couldn't help but envy his friend that he was finally saying his vows. As the rest of the ranch hands began to help him prepare the field for the ceremony and clear the aisle for the bride and her dress, an idea began to form in Jared's mind. He checked the time on his pocket watch and knew that he had very little time if he wanted his idea to work. He found Caleb shaving in his cabin and hoped his friend would understand. "I need to go into town." "What? Now?" Caleb asked, wiping the blade on a towel. "Yes, now. I'm going to try my best to back in time for the ceremony, but if I ain't, you'll have to forgive me." Caleb turned to him with a curious look. "What could be more important than my wedding day? I'm your best friend," Jared nodded. "That you are, but there is someone more important in my life than you." Jared didn't explain further. He was running out of time. Instead, he hitched the horse to the wagon and set off for town. He would apologize to the horse later for running him so hard, but Jared had a feeling his whole future depended on the plan he was about to execute. Faith had never visited his ranch, and when she did, he wanted to make sure it felt like home to her. That way, when he asked for her hand again, she would be reminded of how happy they had been in Boston. The ceremony was only an hour away when Jared arrived in town. He had very little time and a big task ahead of him, but he wasn't frightened in the least. Jared knew that hard work brought its rewards, and that what he was about to do might just earn him the greatest reward of all: a life with Faith Jones. Chapter 22. "Look how green it is. Isn't it pretty?" Grace asked as she looked around at the landscape. Faith couldn't help but agree. It was as if Riverview was greener with more pastures on the horizon than there were in Waterfall. "It is. I'm so glad we came. We hardly see any part of the country at all except for the ranch." Grace was clearly excited about traveling further than town for a change. The morning had been chaotic. Between dressing for Annie's wedding and getting all the people, children, and luggage loaded, they had barely managed to get on the road in time. According to Travis, they would arrive just in time for the ceremony. It had been debated whether to return to Waterfall after the ceremony, but both her sisters' husbands had decided it would be best to spend the night in town at a boarding house rather than make the long journey back to Waterfall after dark. Angel, Travis, and Jacob traveled in the wagon in the front, and Faith traveled with Grace and her family. "We'll arrive right on time," Grace's husband said as they drove the thoroughfare in the town of Riverview. "Shouldn't we stop to secure lodgings?" Grace asked as they passed a hotel and a boarding house. "That would be wise," he agreed. A short while later, they were back on the road and headed out of town. Faith wasn't sure what to expect, but when the ranch came into view, it simply took her breath away. It was easy to see that Jared's cattle operation was just as big as Travis's. Only once they approached the main house did Faith realize what Jared had meant by a large house. The cabin was almost twice the size of the cabin on Scott Ranch. The porch railing, the barn, and every fixed object was decorated with wildflowers. A smile curved Faith's mouth as she realized how enchanted Annie would be by all the trouble gone to for her wedding. "Here we are," Grace announced. Once everyone was on solid ground, the men tended to the horses. Faith glanced down at the sapphire dress Angel had insisted she wear for the occasion and wondered if it wasn't a little too dressy for a wedding on a ranch in the middle of summer. As if sensing her doubt, Grace smiled at her with confidence. "You'll take his breath away." Faith quickly looked away to hide her blush. They moved to the field where the ceremony was being held, but even as her eyes scanned the guests for Jared, she couldn't seem to find him anywhere. Even when they took their seats and the pastor began the service, she couldn't find Jared. Fear began to crawl up her spine, the feeling unfamiliar and daunting as doubts began to rush through her mind. Had Jared finally tired of trying to win her over from her grief? Had he left his own ranch just to avoid facing her? With every second that passed, the doubts seemed to multiply. By the time Annie and Caleb said their vows, Faith was ready to run back to Waterfall. The guests clapped and tossed flower buds into the air as the newly married couple walked back down the aisle as Mr. and Mrs. Mason. Faith smiled at Annie and truly felt happy for her friend, although she was beginning to doubt the wisdom in her attending. Why invite them if he wanted to avoid her? As the guests began to indulge in all the refreshments and food that had been set out for the celebrations, Faith found herself wandering off. She stood in front of the porch of the cabin and couldn't help but be curious as to the interior of Jared's house. She glanced over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching before she ascended the steps. There were 2 rocking chairs on the porch, almost inviting her to take a seat and watch the sunset. She remembered her letters to Jared and wished she could go back to that time again, when her heart was light and her future was filled with nothing but dreams and excitement. When she stepped through the door, she couldn't help but feel guilty. She was trespassing without invitation. Her eyes scanned the vast living room before they landed on the John Broadwood grand piano. Faith's breath caught as she was captivated by the exquisite instrument standing beneath the window. Her feet began to move even as the music began to thrum through her veins. Without even bothering to ask or to see if she had an audience, Faith sat down and revealed the keys. She breathed in the scent unique to a piano of its quality and ran her fingers over the ivories. As if someone had blown life into her veins again, she felt a smile curve the corners of her mouth. Faith closed her eyes and began to play from memory, her fingers moving over the keys as if they were long-lost friends becoming reacquainted. It was the first time she had touched a piano since losing her parents. It was the first time she felt alive since losing her parents. When the song reached its crescendo, she felt a pair of hands rest on her shoulders. Faith knew she probably had to stop, but she simply couldn't. Her head, her body, and her soul moved with the music as she continued to play until the very end. When she played the final note, a tear slipped over her cheek. Music was what she needed to pull her back from her grief. "There you are," Jared's voice whispered beside her ear. Faith turned and looked up at him, feeling her heart swell with love. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't just have wandered into your home. I'm sure you don't want me here." "Why wouldn't I want you here?" Jared asked, confused. "Because you weren't at the service. I understand if you want to avoid me." Faith began to stand up, but Jared took a seat beside her. He turned her chin so that she could face him and smiled into her eyes. "I wasn't at the service because I was busy trying to carry this monstrosity into my house. For you." "For me?" Faith asked, confused. "For you. I realized this morning that you didn't only lose your parents, you lost your music too. I can never bring your parents back, Faith, but I hope that if I gave you back your music, perhaps you'll come back from your grief and remember how much I care for you." Faith gasped quietly. "You did all this for me, but I've been so distracted. You've been grieving. If you allow me to call you my wife, I want to do so much more for you. I want to make this your home. I want to love you and protect you, and I want for you never to wonder where you belong ever again. I want you to belong with me." Jared held her gaze, and Faith felt his love warm her from the inside out. Her heart leaped with joy as she met his gaze and smiled. "You've been patient and kind and understanding, and now you've given me back the one thing I didn't even realize I'd lost. I'd be honored to be your wife. Jared brushed a kiss over her lips and smiled into her eyes. Play it for me again, Claire de Lune. Faith's laughter blended with the beautiful notes of the expensive piano as she played for the man she loved. Epilogue. Goodness, at the rate these young uns are eating, you'll have to start running more cattle, Angel complained as she continued to plate second helpings of food. Travis laughed and brushed a kiss over her forehead. That can be arranged. Faith and Grace began to laugh as Travis left the kitchen to join the men outside. It was the middle of summer, and the heat was stifling. Instead of the expensive dresses the Jones sisters had once worn on the streets of Boston, they wore lightweight cotton dresses that could withstand the heat. With calving season over, the hardest work of the year lay ahead for cattle ranchers. Branding calves was an exhausting task, one that few ranchers tried to do on their own. Last week, Faith and Jared traveled to Waterfall along with Annie and Caleb for a few days to help with the cattle. Today, they were all gathered on Reed Ranch to help Travis with his season's calves. Faith stood in her kitchen for a moment and just mused at the chaos around her. She and Jared had already been blessed with 2 children of their own. Then there were Angel's 4 young guns, along with Grace's 3. Altogether, they had a total of 9 children running around. You could hear their squeals of joy as the cousins played. It was a sound Faith knew her parents would have loved. 5 years after the tragedy that had claimed the lives of her parents, Faith still grieved for them now and then. But mostly, she rejoiced in the joy she and her sisters had found in their new lives. She knew that her parents would be looking down on them with pride and joy. A glance out the window rewarded her with a glimpse of Jared, and her heart skipped a beat. Although they had been married for almost 5 years, Faith still thanked the Lord for her wonderful husband every single day. She had never met a man more patient, kind, or understanding, or one that could be a better father. But then her sisters would say the same of their husbands. But Faith knew her journey with Jared had been a harder one. A shallower man would have bid her farewell when she had been caught up in her grief, but Jared knew how to bring her back to life. Only later had she learned that the piano she had played on Annie's wedding day had been bought from the hotel in town that very morning. Jared had offered the hotelier double its value to have him agree for him to take it right away. She turned and smiled at the piano that still graced their living room. Just like Annie and Caleb were part of their family, the piano had just as important a role. It was played to bring joy, to bring peace, and mostly it was played to remember the many nights she had played for her parents. Jacob says he's still hungry, Jared said, coming through the front door. What did I just say? Angel said, shaking her head. That boy is going to grow up to be the size of a giant with the amount of food he eats. Jacob took after his father in more ways than one. He had inherited his father's appearance, and it was clear he was going to be as tall or taller even than Travis. We'll grill some more beef, let the kid eat. He's working pretty hard, Jared said, pointing out the window. Angel, Grace, and Faith sighed proudly as Jacob, now 8 years old, wrestled a calf to the ground. Faith had lived on a cattle ranch long enough to know that although they were called calves, they were as strong as oxen in her opinion. Faith poured a glass of milk for her husband, which he drank down immediately. I best get back out there, Jared said before chastely pressing a kiss to Faith's cheek. Faith blushed lightly and smiled at her husband. Anything I can do to help? Angel and Grace are in charge of the food. Jared glanced at the piano and smiled at her with hope in his eyes. Make it a happy one, and open the windows. Faith's laughter followed her husband out the front door. Not only was she blessed to have a wonderful husband, but she was also blessed to have one that loved music almost as much as she did. You heard him, Angel encouraged as she plated food for Jacob. Faith moved to the piano and opened it. She slid her fingers over the keys as she did every time before she played, as if she was greeting the piano with an affectionate handshake. When her fingers began to dance, music filled the air. She played with everything she had, allowing herself to be lost in the music. The children danced on the porch, and the men smiled at each other, grateful for the music to lighten their workload even as Angel and Grace began to dance in the kitchen. Faith smiled to herself as she glanced up at the roof. I wish you were here, but you are in our hearts.